And they that worship him shall worship him in spirit and in truth. And so we're continuing in our study on origins. Origins. We started out looking at the origins of the wicked devices of the enemy and where they came from, because we really want to take some time to kind of get to the root of the world system beyond Babylon. Like most of the time we kind of want to anchor the whole world system in Babylon. And while it is true that that is where it was first established and had a name and a platform from which it grew, and we saw people operating in that system, what we've learned over the last several programs is that system found its place in devices and processes and cultures that were first established by Cain, who was influenced under the authority of Satan, who was found in the garden. So this thing goes all the way back to the beginning. And so if we're going to understand how to not so much operate in it, but operate above it and operate against it, we're going to first need to understand who we're operating against. And so recently, the Lord has been really dealing with me about his word. And over and over again, I keep hearing him say, speak my word from my perspective. You guys speak my word from your perspective. Speak the word from my perspective. Speak the word from my perspective. And so I keep thinking, what do you mean? I'm a human. How do I speak the word from your perspective? He says, it's my word. It's my word. So if you look at the word from heaven, rather than looking at the word from earth, then you would understand that I'm not wrestling with you and you're not wrestling with me. I'm dealing with him. And you are going to have to work with me against him. Else he will use you to work against me. And I said, wow. That's the reason why we have to understand who the enemy is and what system it is he's operating through. In the beginning, God. Then Satan was there. And then man. And there's been an ongoing struggle between God and Satan for the control, dominion, and authority of man. But if we don't recognize him in all of his many forms, in all of the ways that he has infiltrated the world and established the world system, then we won't know when we're operating in him and when we're operating outside of him. We have to know who he is and recognize him when we see him. People say, don't bow, don't bow, don't bow, don't bow. But if you don't know what he looks like, then you won't know when you're bowing. So, I wanted to talk about the next few shows that we do. We're going to talk about a divine bloodline with some evil blood. I got that from God, I know I did. A divine bloodline with some evil blood. Now let that sink into your mind for a second. A divine bloodline. Because God made man. But there's some evil blood that has penetrated and infiltrated and permeated and saturated and worked its way. Yes, no, I'm not a geneticist. I am not a geneticist, but I'm going to give you some biblical genetics as we go through this process. We're going to check some genealogies. We're going to look at some ancestries. We're going to look at some origins. We're going to look at where things came from and how they got to be what they are today. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a natural example. I hold in my hand my own DNA sample. I had it done. Funny thing, the Lord had me do this months ago. I was watching a television show, and it's not inexpensive, but I was watching a television show, and just as plain as, and I've seen many of them before. I mean, who hasn't seen Maury? Yes, the kid is yours. No, the kid's not yours. Whatever. Okay, gotta go find another 5 daddies. Who knows? But, you know, so I've known DNA has been around for a long time now. I mean, not forever, but I can remember a time when I had no idea what DNA was really intended to do. But in recent years, I mean, DNA is just as normal now for this generation as, you know, a blood test to test your O positive, A positive, B positive was in my age group. And so this is my DNA test. And what it says is, now I'm going to give you some information that kind of shocked members of my own family. So now I'm going to give you a little insight into me. And in fact, even, you know, to some extent shocked me. But I think it's so important for us to really grasp how deep this thing is. Because what we're really talking about is a divine family. God wanted a family. And he started with a man. And then he made a woman. And then he made children. And from those children came more children. So he started out with a plan for a family. And then the wicked bloodline interceded and intervened in the process, interrupted the process along the way. And so he had to narrow his relationship with the large family that he originally envisioned down to a prototype. And through that prototype, he's building it back out again. That's all. Down the large picture, down to the prototype, and then back out again, just like an hourglass, right? That's time, right? The purpose of time, to take infinity, narrow it down, and to a time, and then it'll expand back out into infinity again. So, back to me. This is my DNA. And what it basically says is what you would imagine. Now, when you look at me, what do you see? You see a woman. You probably say, well, I see an African American woman. And in both cases, you'd be right. As an African American woman, you would say you really wouldn't have any idea. You know, I could be African American, but having an ancestry found in anywhere on the globe. Because of the nature of the African diaspora, I could have very well come from any number of countries by way of my ancestors. In fact, I've never really given much thought to where my ancestors came from. It never really was something that was significant enough to me to explore, which is why it was kind of surprising to me when the Lord said to go and do this, have this DNA test done. I'm thinking, number one, it's not expensive, Lord. It's not inexpensive, Lord. And number two, you know, like, how would I ever know anyway? As most of us in this country, it's very difficult for us to trace it back to any particular person. So what's the point? I mean, of course, I happen to come from a family on both my mother and my father's side where our ancestry in this country has been pretty well preserved for several generations going back. And that's always been good enough for me. I never really particularly cared to know all of the international story. But God had a different plan. I did the DNA check, and this is what came out of it. And so I learned that genetically speaking, I happen to be, as probably many African Americans are, about 80% African, West African to be specific, and Yoruban, whatever that is. Like, I had to go and study these things. I am a wonderful biblical scholar. I am not so great with genealogies outside of this book, so I'll just be honest. I did not know much about the Yoruban peoples. The interesting thing to me was that I learned that they are in fact a people, but not necessarily a people with a land. I mean, even on that continent, in the African continent, the Yoruban people don't really have a specific land. You have a lot of them found in Nigeria and Benin and other countries in Africa, but not particularly a land for the Yoruban people. And I learned that many of the Yoruban people didn't start coming to this country by way of slavery till the very end of slavery, till the latter parts of slavery. They are all over but because of the diaspora, and in fact just because of the migration of the people from Africa in ancient history, they are people who are found in multiple continents and in many countries around the globe. So I come from a people here who don't particularly know what country they came from. Only to find that I came from a people there who don't particularly know what country they come from. So I'm like, I look at God when I get this, of course, me, and I think, what a funny joke. What a funny joke. This is interesting. So, I still don't know. The 20%, however, as many of us are in this country, is European. What I found, in fact, is that I am about 20% European, made up basically of Finnish, French, Orcadian, Romanian, Russian, and Spanish. One of the things I thought was so interesting was that it lists like possible relatives, third, fourth, and fifth cousins and so forth, people that would be your closest relatives in the database for the DNA people. But I have a cousin, I won't tell you her full name, but like the last names that are in my family bloodline are people from everywhere. They are Petrovics and Broadhursts, McLeans. Then there are some that I would feel, like I could relate to, Matlocks, Epps, Sargents. But when you look at the broader, the more distant beyond these, and I have no idea who these people are, mind you, but when you look at the broader group of people, they range over 5 generations, and they're from Cuba, and they're from France, and they're from Italy, and they're from Australia, and they're from everywhere. And I'm thinking, who are the, I can't even explain this. Like, as I said, I'm not a geneticist, but going through this process and learning it months ago, like when was this? This was back in September the Lord led me to do this. And then now this study, all of the sudden, it makes sense to me. We're all part of God's family. We're all part of God's family. Remember that. I want you to remember those things because as we go forward, it's going to play directly into, now I understand why the Lord had me to do it. Because as we go forward, it's going to make so much sense in our study, which we're going to get into right now. So by way of background, I'm going to, you can go back to previous shows. I don't have time today to take you back through all of the previous shows over the past several weeks and bring you up to speed, but it's all there. So I'm going to give you a quick recap, right? In the beginning, God, Adam, Eve, garden. Adam, Eve, fall. give birth to Cain, Abel. Cain kills Abel, goes out and builds a city, the very first city with walls. So, some interesting things about Cain that I think we should point out. Cain was the first to set weights and measures. God never intended weights and measures. Why would God never intend weights and measures? Because everything belongs to God. So why does he need man to set up weights and measures for him? God will set the boundaries. God will determine the weights and the measures. When man goes about deciding he's going to set up weights and measures, what is his purpose for doing so? His purpose for doing so is for amassing wealth to himself and parceling out what he believed needed to be parceled out. Cain was also the first one who built a fortified city. So he was the one who went out and started setting boundaries. According to Josephus, the first one to go out and start setting boundaries for the land. God never set boundaries on the land. He did after, but Cain was the first in the land to start demarcating it and dividing up God's land for himself. That's an interesting note. We also know that Cain did the cursed thing. Before he killed his brother, he was already being rebellious by going to work in the cursed ground. Josephus called it forcing the ground. That God, he had cursed the ground. Remember in the garden, the ground was cursed. The ground was always intended to just bring forth its fruit. Bring forth its fruit. God called it and it brought forth. He called it and it brought forth. He called it and it brought forth. With his words, he had dominion and authority, and he operated in dominion capacity. And what he said happened. He called it and it came forth. That was the same authority that he gave us in the earth. He called it and it brought forth. Cain goes out and toils in the ground and forces the ground to bring it forth. Well, he had no choice because God had cursed the ground. So then why would he go and work in the ground that God had cursed? That he would have to force by toil and labor to cause it to bring forth its fruit. His brother, on the other hand, went and dealt with the animals. He was a shepherd. You know what the animals do? They grow under the power of God. You don't have to do anything to an animal. It's going to grow under the power and the word of God. Whatever God called it to be, that's what it's going to be. Right? Whatever he says, that's what it is. Now, we also know that there's some crazy stuff going on in the world system today, and cloning and genetics and all kinds of, stuff going on there. That's another system at work. But God, in God's system, he calls it forth and it grows according to what he called it. And so Cain goes out and toils in the earth and then kills his brother and then goes out and builds a fortified city. And then he has children, wives and children and great-grandchildren. And then all the way down the road, he has great-great-great-grandsons, like 7 generations down, Lamech. Lamech has 2 sons with 1 woman. And from the way the Bible reads, they're twins. And they're Jabal and Jubal. And one is a nomadic tent maker and a herdman of cattle. The other is a composer and musician. And then he has another son with a woman named Zillah, and that son's name is Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain is an artificer, forger, teacher of every cutting tool from brass and bronze. And he has a sister named Naamah, and Naamah is called the mother of divination. If you take these 4 siblings and put them together, you end up with the foundations of the wicked devices of the enemy. And if you go back to the other show, you'll see what those wicked devices were. You'll find that they were founded in music and weapons and mass marketing and distribution and divination. Well, and I don't know if we discussed the divination in the last show. I think that's where I didn't mention Nama, who was the sister, and she was the mother of sorcery. So there you have it all. Everything that the enemy has ever used to operate, right there in the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis. It's already there, letting us know what the enemy's wicked devices are and how he uses them. As we go forward, we're going to see how they get institutionalized, but the devices are established right up front, way before the flood. Then there's another Lamech, who is the ancestor of Seth, who was made in the image and likeness of Adam, who was made in the image and likeness of God. And Seth had a son named Enos, and after his son Enos was born, men began to call on the name of God. Now imagine all of that wickedness going on prior to that time, where nobody was calling on God. But now, remember, they were marrying and intermarrying. There was no knowledge of God, but they were marrying and intermarrying with one another. The sons of God, the ones who were made in the image and likeness of God, and the ones who were in Cain's lineage were marrying and intermarrying with one another, and wickedness was just growing exponentially down through the generations. So there came a time when Noah was it. Noah was it. And he was also the son of a Lamech. And the Lord had him to build the ark. And they got on the ark, and they stayed on the ark for a year. And then they came out of the ark on the other side. And this is where we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 9. When they are on the other side and they're coming out, at that time, Noah was 601 years old. And his son Shem was 98 years old. And they came out on the other side. Now, we often wonder, how did the curse end up on the other side? Well, there'll be a few things in here that we'll pick up along the way that will give us some insight into how the curse might have ended up on the other side. And so we'll pick up in Genesis chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Now, let's kind of take a second here and go back to Genesis 1:28, where God first gave that very same command. At Genesis 1:28, he says, And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now remember, I just said, God said the word, and everything in creation, animals, birds of the air, fish of the sea, the ground, everything was supposed to operate just as it did for God. Under the unction of his word, it was supposed to bring forth and do whatever it is it was instructed to do. And that authority was given to man. At this point, God anticipated that all of creation would be under the express dominion, management, authority of mankind. But when you get over here to Noah, there is a subtle change. And he says, the fear and dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth. So all of a sudden, what sounded once like harmony with man, that man had authority and dominion, and that there was one language, and whatever man said happened, regardless of whether he was talking to a tree or whether he was talking to a bird, that was lost. And now it was about fear and dread. And so there was somehow hostility between man and beast that did not seem to be in the garden prior to the flood and prior to wickedness finding its way into the garden, of course. The word serpent in Hebrew means hiss. The serpent, however, was not supposed to be able to talk, but somehow he was able to speak. Josephus says, following this process, when he was cast down on his belly, he also lost his ability to speak. And at that point, the serpent was no longer able to communicate directly with mankind. What's important to notice in chapter 9, right at the very beginning, is that God blessed all three sons of Noah. We often hear so much about the curse of Ham, the curse of Ham, the curse of Ham, which we'll find later actually was the curse of Canaan because of an act of Ham, and there are a lot of theories for why the curse ended up on Canaan, even though it appeared that the wicked act was done by Ham. But the most important thing to pay attention to is that God blessed all three sons. And yes, Ham did an abominable thing. But what God blesses, no man, no matter how righteous he is, can curse what God has already blessed. So I'm going to submit to you as we go forward that what Noah placed on Ham was a limited curse in that he could not stop his ability to do what God said, which was to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now, we're going to find that almost nobody had a knowledge of God. Divine bloodline, wicked blood. So we're going to find that almost nobody had a knowledge of God going through this process. So it's not that Ham was the only one that had no knowledge of God. That was not the case. But we will see down throughout history that there are some distinctions between the three brothers. But they are nonetheless three brothers. Three brothers from whom all humanity came. Three brothers from whom all things that we see came forth from this blessing. And it was not that one disappeared from the earth and the others went on and flourished. We don't even see a place in history where one served the others in the way that you would think if the curse had been placed on them by God, then you would see a perpetually, eternally subservient slave to two other groups of people on this earth. But we have never, ever seen that since the beginning. We've seen examples of just about every one of the three brothers finding themselves in some sort of subservient slave situation. So he could not have been speaking about that. I think in this country, because we are so hardwired into the context of slavery because of the origins of this nation, and I think there's a biblical context for it as well. I think you'll be able to gather from this process that there is in fact a biblical context for how it may have come about in this country. But that does not take away from the fact that every single brother has found at some point their descendants subservient to another. So let's explore this from, as I said at the beginning, God's perspective, not man's limited perspective based on man's limited geography and man's limited experience and man's bias, man's prejudice, man's need for superiority, need for control, need for authority, need to use the word of God to exercise control over another. Let's take all of that off of the table and see the world as God saw the world. God saw three brothers. Three brothers. Three brothers.